Jesus can demonstrate his equality with God his Father by the miracles, by the healings, by his forgiveness of people that otherwise only God could do, by doing things and walking in ways that, and even allowing titles and worship and things to be given to him that are exclusively reserved for God. So this is the way we interpret the Bible. This is the Hebraic worldview, but it's the worldview that God built into the text. So Tim describes it this way. Let's keep reading Tim. He says, in the end, the Hebraic worldview has learned to be at home with mystery. And I might also add, learn to be at home with paradox or tension, right? The comparative perspective that Tim is going to describe, he says, while the goal of solving quadratic equations is to discover the value of the unknown element, the goal of knowing God is worship, right? The Hebrew word for worship is avodah or avodah. So he's comparing kind of the modern liberal philosophical Greek worldview, which is carried over into modern liberal analytical ways of thinking as well. He's comparing that to the worldview and the value of that's kind of built into the Hebrew cultural aspect of the text. And so I'm not saying that the Jews have everything right. Don't fill in that. Don't assume that. Don't insinuate that. That's not what I'm implying, that everything that the Jews approach to the text is right. To be sure, modern Judaism has gone far astray as well. There's a lot of philosophical mumbo jumbo in modern rabbinic Judaism today as well that's just way out there, and I wouldn't agree with it anyway either. What we're trying to say is we need to get back to the cultural, historical, biblical worldview, right? Which means we have to kind of turn the clock back and look at Judaism before it was corrupted by the rabbis. How did Moshe approach the text? How did the apostolic writers approach the text? What did Paul think of the Tanakh? And so what we're trying to say is that Paul had no problem describing God as the creator, and yet in other texts describing Jesus as the creator, the agency of creation as well. John apparently didn't have any problem saying that the Word was both God and with God at the same time. That creates tension. And so what we're discussing here in this section of our Exploring the Shema discussions on the issues of Trinity is this notion of the idea that as modern readers and students of the text today, in our modern age, we're going to have to simply let the text speak the way it speaks and provide the thought processes in order for us to understand where mystery has its place. Oftentimes, the writer of the text would speak of the mystery and majesty of God and yet not explain it. Paul's a good case in point, and I think in the middle of Corinthians, I'll show you this later, but right in the middle of Corinthians, he's having this discussion with his readers about some mundane issue of eating food offered to idols. And then right in the middle of talking about food offered to idols, which is kind of a practical issue that they were dealing with in their day. We don't have that issue today so much, but just follow along with my example. Right in the middle of this discussion, I'll bring up the reference later. I'm not going to do it right now. But right in the middle of this discussion, Paul just turns in the middle and says, we know that there's one God. For other people, there's lots of gods and idols, and we know that they're not truly gods. I'm paraphrasing. We know that they're not truly gods, but they're so-called gods, and people think they're gods, but they're really demonic entities. But for us, there's one God, and there's also one Lord, our Messiah. And right in the middle, he kind of throws in this idea that according to the Shema, there's one God and one Lord, but he applies the word God to God the Father, but he applies the word Lord to the Lord Yeshua. So you see what he's doing is he's transforming the kind of the natural understanding of the Shema that there's one God, and he's expanding this to include the fact that Yeshua is part of the mystery of the Godhead. Understand what I'm saying? The Shema says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." It uses the word Lord and God in Deuteronomy 6:4 and 6:5. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." But Paul says, for us, there's one God and one Lord. And for Paul, he takes the word God, which is the Greek word theos, and he applies it to God the Father. But he takes the word Lord, which is the Greek word kurios, and applies it to Yeshua. He takes the Deuteronomy Shema, and he opens our eyes to understand that it's Trinitarian as well, right? That what God was actually giving way back in Deuteronomy was, in its seminal form, foundational form, monotheistic Trinitarian. Paul can see that because his eyes have been opened by the Spirit. But the point I'm trying to bring up is that he does this right in the middle of this practical, everyday, mundane conversation about eating food offered to idols. Why can Paul do that without stopping to explain the philosophical backgrounds and all the intricacies of Trinity and explaining it? Why does he have to do? He doesn't have to do that, because in his world, and in his perspective, it was natural to understand that God has revealed himself in the person of his Son, Messiah. The Word made flesh is now walking among us. And we don't have to explain that to everyone, at least to our own believers, or the believing communities, because it's now something we've come to accept. Remember, the writings of the New Testament were written after the fact. The Trinity was revealed kind of in the intertestamental period, in which the history actually played itself out, when Jesus came, walked and talked, and then left. And then the Bible was written, the New Testament part was written after that took place. So by the time the New Testament was written, the Trinitarian perspective was already a reality to the believers. They weren't discovering it again. We read the writing as if it's kind of playing out in real time, but in fact, it's actually already history.